We really appreciate being here with you. This is a remarkable turnout, and we feel very privileged to join you. I do work during the daytime as an anesthesiologist. What that means is that I put people to sleep. Okay? I hope I don't do that today. Most of us here believe in Joseph Smith as a prophet of the living God. We have probably read the Book of Mormon and the revelations that Joseph Smith gave to us, like the Doctrine and Covenants and the Pearl of Great Price. We may have also participated in ordinances that the prophet restored, like baptism or the ordinances of the temple. Depending upon how much we have studied, we may know a great deal about Joseph Smith's teachings and practices, or we may be mostly unaware of details that were not shared in official church publications. Some of you may already know quite a bit about Joseph Smith's practice of polygamy, but for some, it may be quite new. And whether you have strong opinions and beliefs regarding it or are simply seeking a more complete understanding, we want to discuss the most common fears people have shared with us concerning it. Fear number one: did Joseph Smith introduce plural marriage to expand his sexual opportunities? This is a common concern, and understandably so. If I were to stand on a street corner in a large city and ask people why Joseph introduced polygamy among the Mormons, the vast majority would likely say that he just wanted sex. It is inescapable. People who are unfamiliar with our history and doctrine would struggle to imagine any other reason. The possibility that Joseph was commanded by God to practice polygamy will not occur to the average person. They would not naturally associate Joseph's polygamy with that of Abraham, Jacob, or Moses. Joseph Smith outlined 3 reasons in section 132 for why polygamy was sanctioned, and satisfying a person's libido was not one of them. And I want to just talk about these 3 reasons that are found in section 132. The first one is it was a specific trial. Virtually none of the early polygamists wanted to practice plural marriage. They get portrayed otherwise, but this is the truth. They didn't want to do it. All of the women and almost all of the men. John Taylor said, "Where did this commandment come from in relation to polygamy? It came from God. It was a revelation given unto Joseph Smith from God and was made binding upon his servants. When this system was first introduced among the people, it was one of the greatest crosses that was ever taken up by any set of men since the world stood. It tried our minds and feelings. We saw it was something that was going to be heavy upon us. It was not that very nice, pleasing thing some people thought about it. It is something that harried up our feelings. Did we believe it? Yes, we did. I did. The whole rest of the brethren did, but still, we should have been glad to push it off a little further. We would have been glad if it did not come in our day, but that somebody else had something to do with it instead of us." The second reason is to multiply and replenish the earth. While the number of polygamists was never proportionately a majority, of the men who engaged in it fathered more children than their monogamous counterparts. This is the only reason mentioned in the Book of Mormon explaining why God might command plural marriage. It's Jacob 2, verse 30. Early polygamists felt that they were raising up a righteous generation. Multiplying and replenishing the earth requires sexuality. Yet no children have been documented from any of the unions between Joseph Smith and his plural wives. Many of the time and eternity sealings were consummated. But there is no evidence that sexuality was a primary focus of the relationships. Many of the women remarried after the martyrdom and bore numerous children to their husbands, and their fertility suggests that offspring would have resulted if frequent conjugality with Joseph had occurred. Frankly, there were easier ways for him to expand his sexual opportunities if that were his goal. The third reason from section 132 about regarding why we need polygamy is what we sometimes call the easy answer. The Old Testament prophets did it, and Joseph was a prophet restorer, and so he restored it as part of a restitution of all things that's mentioned in Acts 3:19 through 21. However, it really is not that simple. Joseph reported receiving keys to seal on earth that which would be sealed in heaven, allowing husbands and wives to be together forever. Eternal marriage is, in my view, his zenith doctrine, his highest doctrine. Plural marriage is apparently a practice that is sometimes divinely sanctioned, but not always, like in the Book of Mormon times when it was prohibited. Unfortunately, there are still many questions regarding novel polygamy that we just can't answer. For example, Joseph Smith was sealed to 30 to 40 women, which seems like a lot, even if many of the unions were eternity-only sealings, which are non-sexual sealings and only for the next life. And I also think it's important to observe that none of Joseph Smith's plural wives ever accused him of abuse or deception, including the 7 who did not gather to Utah with the main body of the church. Decades after their feelings had matured and their youthful perspectives had been expanded by additional experiences with marriage and sexual relations, none of them claimed they were victimized or beguiled by the prophet. None of them wrote an expose to tell the world he was a seducing impostor. None of them, wrote that Joseph's polygamy was a sham or a cover-up for illicit sexual relations. Had any of Joseph's plural wives eventually decided that he had taken advantage of them, there would have been plenty of anti-Mormon presses willing to publish what they had to say. And their subsequent scorn might have motivated them to go and write these types of publications. The second fear, and this is by far the most common question that we get asked, Laura and I even noticed it was already in some of the questions that have come up, is about, did Joseph Smith share or steal other men's wives? Joseph Smith was sealed to 14 women with legal husbands. We can document this. I mean, there's some of the marriages aren't that well documented, but it was 14 or less. Of all of the issues, this is the one that we get asked about the most, and it's called polyandry. Polyandry is the practice of females having more husbands than one at the same time. And while we don't have all the details that we'd like, I really think that we can figure out a possible motivation for the behavior that we see. And most church members are unaware that in Nauvoo, a few women were allowed to be sealed to a man just for the next life, and that's this eternity-only sealing I mentioned. The sealed women remained the legal husband of her civil husband during mortality, during this life, but would become the wife of another after their death. And this seems odd, okay? There's no escaping that. It just seems kind of strange. But at that time, it was viewed as necessary for women whose husbands were not active Latter-day Saints, and there were several. We need to remember that the Latter-day Saints in Nauvoo, in Joseph Smith's day, generally believed that the second coming was going to be very soon. And Joseph taught them that in order to be exalted, they would need an eternal companion. Some of these women were married to non-Mormons, to whom they could not be sealed for obvious reasons. However, several of the women were civilly wed to devout church members. And why they chose Joseph instead of their legal husband is not clear. However, Lucy Walker remembered this, and Lucy was one of Joseph's plural wives. She recalled a woman would have her choice. This was a privilege that could not be denied her. Frankly, we might have expected Joseph to not allow such sealings, but to encourage the woman to work on their legal marriages and to be sealed to those husbands. And by allowing these sealings for eternity, critics might accuse Joseph of stealing men's wives for eternity, but it would not apply to this life. The irony is that no woman was forced. They all had their choice, and none of the men ever complained against Joseph. Critics consistently fail to share these historical facts when they are discussing these plural marriages. There is a persistent criticism I want to address, and that was that Joseph would send men on missions and then quickly marry their wives. And this is simply false. Of the 14 husbands, 10 definitely were not on missions at the time their legal wives were sealed to Joseph. The only documented case is Apostle Orson Hyde, who had been gone almost 2 years before his legal wife was sealed to Joseph. And then we have 2 sealing dates for her, Miranda Hyde, and one of them is after he had returned, and so it's just confusing to know what really happened. And then in the other 3 cases, we don't have marriage dates for the sealing to Joseph, so there's no way to know. So to recap, it appears that most of Joseph's 14 sealings to legally married women were just for the next life or eternity-only ceremonies. And then there is one relationship, that of Mary and Herod, where it is just too poorly documented to know. We can only guess at what happened. Multiple authors have observed that several of Joseph's plural wives experienced 2 marriage ceremonies, one legal and one religious, and then they advanced the theory of polyandry, expressing very little skepticism regarding such a controversial practice. Unexplored are important questions like, what did the women believe regarding the validity of both marriages after the second ceremony? Or why is there no evidence from any of these women or any other Nauvoo polygamy insider reflecting the belief that a woman could have 2 husbands at the same time? Reports of polyandry in Nauvoo appear to describe a remarkably unconventional behavior that is just without context. Some researchers may assume that a plurality of wives creates a context for a plurality of husbands. But from a religious and even a social standpoint, it appears to be a logical fallacy. For example, in Islam, Muslim men are allowed to practice polygamy with up to 4 wives, but polyandry is not permitted. In Judaism, multiple wives was permitted in Levirate marriages, but the practice of polyandry is condemned. The Hindus have allowed plurality of wives according to their caste system, but polyandry is not permitted. In Christianity, polygamy is acknowledged as an Old Testament practice, but is disallowed today, and Paul condemns polyandry in very unambiguous language in Romans. And then if we look at the early church leaders, and I won't quote them here, but all of them, leaders and members who we can find references to polyandry, they mention how it was condemned. And then in 1891, in a magazine called the Popular Science Monthly, they had an article on polyandry. This is 1891, and I was surprised to find this, but it says, "It is inconceivable that men should have voluntarily instituted polyandry. Even if by doing violence to our common sense, we suppose such a thing to be possible on the part of the men, how would the women submit? Now, these observations do not mean that Joseph Smith could not have introduced and practiced polyandry, but they seem to generate valid questions of how he might have convinced devout, Bible-believing women into accepting such a novel sexual association. It couldn't have been presented as a restoration of a religious practice, as a plurality of wives had been. In fact, there is no religious basis for polyandry that I can identify. It seems that pre-existing religious beliefs would have only created obstacles. We might imagine a man in Nauvoo seducing a woman for a tryst. Yet, Joseph Smith's marriages started with a sealing ceremony that was viewed by others like witnesses and the officiator, and it was known to church members. Although late and distant voices declare that these sealings authorize polyandry, none of the participants left statements supporting this view. And then 1 week ago, we're going to hear from him later, Brother Perigo, Dr. Perigo, was with us in Salt Lake City, where we presented at the Mormon History Association, and he was able to share the results of a 15-year project showing that the most likely candidate that we thought would be a daughter of Joseph Smith by a plural wife, in fact, is not. And so the evidence for polyandry just received one more blow. Since there are no plain references to the possibility that a woman could have or ever did have two husbands, it seems that drawing the conclusion that Joseph practiced polyandry goes well beyond the evidence. And while we can't prove polyandry did not happen, we cannot prove that it did happen either. Fear number 4. Did Joseph Smith marry young women because he was a pedophile? A pedophile is one who is sexually interested in children, usually defined to be under the age of 11. There is no indication that Joseph Smith ever pursued any children as wives. This term is sometimes used to create fear and sensationalize Joseph's marriages to younger women. Many of Joseph's plural wives were young for today's marrying standards. 4 were 19, 3 were 17, 1 was 16, and 2 were 14 at the time of their sealings to Joseph. As we evaluate these sealings, it is important that we don't let presentism skew our understanding. Presentism occurs when we take today's standards and we superimpose them on another time or on another culture. 14-year-old brides were unusual, but were not scandalous in the 1840s. Emmeline Wells, one of the most respected and well-known Mormon women of the 19th century, was married at the age of 14, but few criticized her decision or view it as obscene. And the difference is likely because Emmeline's marriage was monogamous. Helen Mar Kimball was 14 when she was sealed to Joseph Smith. And she left several records that help us understand why she chose to marry the prophet. Helen related that her father arranged the sealing rather than Joseph because he wanted to be connected to the prophet in the eternities through family relations. Nancy Winchester's sealing, Joseph's second youngest bride, could have served a similar purpose considering the close ties between those two families. I think it's important to recognize that there is no evidence that Joseph sought the unions with the 14-year-olds or that they were ever consummated. They seem to be more akin to a betrothal rather than an actual marriage. Later in Utah, the policy was to wait until the women matured to consummate the plural unions. There is nothing in Helen Mar Kimball's writings indicating any sort of a relationship outside of that brief ceremony with Joseph Smith as being sealed to him. And now, I get to turn the rest of this over to my dear wife, Laura, who will go through the last few fears.
Fear number 5. We know that Joseph was married to many plural wives before Emma knew about it. So we might ask ourselves, how is polygamy without the first wife's knowledge acceptable to the Lord? One of the more bothersome aspects of Joseph Smith's practice of polygamy involves his plural marriages that were conducted without Emma's knowledge. Most members of the church know that Brigham Young and the Utah Saints practiced polygamy. But this element of secrecy from Emma, his legal wife, puts Joseph's practice in a different category. Joseph's first sealing to a plural wife in Nauvoo was on April 5, 1841, but Emma probably didn't find out about that marriage or others until 2 years later. We don't know exactly when Emma found out about Joseph Smith's practice of polygamy, but it was sometime before May 1843. At that time, she accepted Joseph's practice of polygamy for a short time, perhaps a few weeks, as she participated in 4 plural marriages. Thereafter, Emma struggled as she tried to live the principle and share her husband with the plural wives. Interestingly, as much as she hated polygamy, she seemed to maintain a testimony in Joseph as a prophet and as the translator of the Book of Mormon. Understandably, we wonder, why did Joseph wait to tell Emma? Most of the suggested reasons for the delay are unsatisfying, so I won't bother to recount them here. By his own admission, Joseph declared he was not perfect. Though we know that prophets are not infallible, accepting the notion that Joseph was not only a fallible man who made mistakes, but also a prophet of God who received divine revelation can be challenging. This is likely more difficult for us who didn't know him personally than those who did. Lorenzo Snow, who knew Joseph in Nauvoo, recalled, quote, "I saw Joseph the prophet do and heard him say things which I never expected to see and hear in a prophet of God, yet I was always able to throw the mantle of charity over improper things," unquote. He also commented, quote, "When I see the weaknesses and imperfections in him, I thanked God that he put upon a man who had these imperfections the power and authority which he placed upon him. For I knew I myself had weakness, and I thought there was a chance for me," unquote. Ultimately, this is an issue between Joseph, Emma, and the Lord, though it is a tough thing to accept. One thing is clear: Joseph and Emma loved each other deeply. Richard Bushman, the biographer of Joseph Smith, noted that in nearly every letter Joseph wrote to Emma, he declared his love for her. And as Emma wept over Joseph's body after the martyrdom, she declared, "My husband was my crown." Fear number 6, the language and contents of D&C 139 cannot be inspired. For about 50 years after its dictation, the revelation, now known as D&C 132, was considered the revelation on celestial marriage, with the emphasis on celestial plural marriage. It was dictated to convince Emma of its divine nature of the practice of polygamy, and later it was publicly distributed to validate its practice as divinely approved and as an essential part of Mormonism. Both of these needs have evaporated, and church policy regarding the earthly practice of polygamy has changed, but the scripture remains. After the manifesto was issued in 1890, references to its contents declined dramatically. One of the defining characteristics of D&C 132 is that it is in what I call raw format. It didn't go through the process that other revelations dictated by Joseph Smith went through before it was incorporated into our scriptures. Reviewing the process might help us understand why the raw format has caused distress among members that might have been avoided. Elder Orson Pratt, who lived with the Smiths for a period of time, described the manner in which the prophet received revelations. Quote, Joseph received the ideas from God, but clothed those ideas with such words that came to his mind, unquote. Wilford Woodruff once wrote of Joseph Smith that he was full of revelation, which he defined as the inspiration of the Holy Ghost to man. In the early days of the church, the revelations were written down and circulated among the members. Because of the inaccuracies that crept into copies, members voted to print the revelations. Orson Pratt described the process of printing these revelations. Quote, Joseph, the prophet, in selecting the revelations from the manuscripts and arranging them for publication, did not arrange them according to the order of the day in which they were given. Either did he think it necessary to publish them all in the Book of Doctrine and Covenants, but left them to be published more fully in his history. Hence, paragraphs taken from the revelations of a later date are, in a few instances, incorporated with those of an earlier date. Indeed, at the time of the compilation, the prophet was inspired in several instances to write additional sentences and paragraphs to the earlier revelations. In this manner, the Lord did truly give, line upon line, here a little and there a little. Section 132 never went through this process because the prophet Joseph Smith was killed on June 27, 1844, and the revelation was not added to the Doctrine and Covenants until 1876. It remains in raw format or unedited, clarified, or added to. The language in D&C 132 is quite harsh at times, much more direct than in other sections. Reflecting on the first time he read the Revelation in 1832, William Law, Joseph's first counselor, who never accepted polygamy, commented on its shocking nature and some of the language directed at Emma. Even in 1878, when plural marriage had become an accepted part of Mormon culture, there was still some controversy about the contents of the revelation. Elder Joseph F. Smith, Hiram Smith's son, remarked in a conference that year, quote, when the revelation was written in 1843, it was for a special purpose, by the request of the patriarch Hiram Smith, and was not then designed to go forth to the church or to the world. It is more probable that had it been written with a view to its going out as a doctrine of the church, it would have been presented in a somewhat different manner. There are personalities, like Emma Smith, contained in a part of it, which are not relevant to the principle itself, but rather to the circumstances which necessitated it being written at the time. So the harsh language was retained, and the revelation itself is confusing in places. Brigham Young once stated that, quote, when revelations are given through an individual appointed to receive them, they are given to the understandings of the people. These revelations, after a lapse of years, become mystified to those who were not personally acquainted with the circumstances at the time they were given, unquote. At least 1/3 of this revelation seems to fall into the mystified category. A small part of the revelation referred to Emma, a larger portion to plural marriage, and by far the largest portion to the new and everlasting covenant of marriage or eternal marriage. But the direct language of the sections intended for Emma are hard for some people to accept, even with the temple language and blessings revealed in the gentler portions. Since July 12, 1843, when it was dictated, no church president has proposed a revision to Joseph's words. So for now, we are left to concentrate on the primary message of D&C 132, which is that righteous couples sealed in the new and everlasting covenant of marriage may qualify for exaltation. Fear number 7. We will need to practice polygamy in the eternities. This is a concern for many women and men as well. D&C 132 speaks of a covenant that must be obeyed. The covenant is eternal marriage, not plural marriage. Exaltation is promised to a couple who live worthily and are sealed by proper authority. Also, there is no record of Joseph Smith or any other priesthood leader stating that all exalted men will be polygamists. President Wilford Woodruff and several other Utah Mormons testified in a court case in 1892. Wilford Woodruff was asked if Joseph Smith had ever taught him at Nauvoo or anywhere else during his lifetime that in order for a man to be exalted in the hereafter, he must have more than one wife. He answered, "I don't know that I ever heard that expression." When asked, "Did Joseph Smith teach you that a man must have more than one wife to be exalted?" Nauvoo polygamist and apostle George A. Smith's wife, Bathsheba Smith, responded, "I never heard of that." A third witness, Joseph C. Kingsbury, was asked if Joseph Smith taught him that a man could not be exalted in the hereafter unless he had more wives than one. Kingsbury replied, "No, sir, he did not teach that. He did not say anything about that." Kingsbury also recalled, "I heard it preached from the stand that a man could be exalted in eternity with one wife." We should also realize that polygamy itself is not a ceremony, a covenant, or an ordinance. It is simply a repetition of the eternal marriage ceremony. Its practice was taught as a commandment between the 1840s and 1890. But if we look at Christian and Jewish religious traditions back to Adam and Eve, it apparently is not essential because we know of none of God's other followers, except perhaps Abraham, who were commanded to be polygamists. The Book of Mormon peoples had one wife, as well as the New Testament saints, so far as we can tell. We should realize that even though earlier Latter-day Saints were polygamists, We don't have to like polygamy. Defending it as being fair to both men and women is really impossible. Polygamy expands a man's emotional and sexual opportunities as a husband, as it diminishes a woman's emotional and sexual opportunities as a wife. It is impossible to model the practice of cleaving to no other on earth as commanded to Adam and Eve as a requirement of marriage within a plural marriage. It isn't necessarily a desirable practice on earth. Brian and I may defend historical details, but we never defend polygamy itself. Virtually no one in Nauvoo wanted to do it, but they submitted to it. It is okay to recognize the suffering of those who practiced it. While not all stories are negative, we can mourn with those who encountered challenging situations due to polygamy. When I study the period, I tend to look at it from Emma's perspective and from the plural wives' perspective. I can imagine the emotional pain both experienced. But we should also note that when plural marriage was suspended in 1890, there were many who grieved the loss and felt conflicted and confused. Polygamy continues to cause fears in women today, and understandably so. I know a woman who said she would rather be single than a polygamist in the eternities. Some worry they will be eternally sealed to a husband they really don't like. Another common concern is that a woman will die and her husband will remarry, making her a polygamist in eternity, but without any choice in the matter. Those who are single in this life fear they will be assigned a polygamous husband in the next life because there will be no monogamous options. Our Heavenly Father presented a plan of happiness. It's not a plan of coercion or a plan of eternal submission. I don't expect He will renege on His promise. Being in an undesired relationship for eternity is not what I consider happiness, and I don't think our Heavenly Father does either. We really should not speculate on what an eternal marriage means. We simply do not know, except that current LDS doctrine teaches that sealings can allow husbands and wives to be together forever. No details are provided beyond this simple statement. We don't have to embrace polygamy. It isn't commanded of us. Feeling uncomfortable with that marital dynamic is a natural reaction. No teachings from our presiding church leaders declare that all exalted beings must be polygamous. God is a loving God. He will respect our righteous desires. And I personally believe that God will respect our agency. It causes undue stress and fear to speculate about what the next life will entail. It is interesting that the Latter-day Saints in Nauvoo and in Utah were the ones given the trial to practice polygamy, but accepting their trial is a trial for us today. I'd like to conclude with an observation a friend shared with me. He noted that the more complex the history, the more nuanced our conclusions should be. And indeed, after studying polygamy for many years, we continue to learn new details. The practice of polygamy certainly falls within the category of complex history. But it is his story and her stories. It doesn't need to be our story. I mentioned earlier that when I think about the early polygamists, I'm tempted to imagine the emotional pain they must have experienced and to judge. The more I do this, the more I become upset. But then I remind myself that someone has already taken care of their pain. It is not my place to take it upon myself or to judge. God has promised us his greatest blessings if we will comply with the commandments required in our day. And that is the tether that I hold on to, even if I don't understand completely why polygamy was practiced among the early saints.
There's no way we're going to get through all of these, but we do want to mention as we get started on the questions, we're happy to talk with you out during the breaks or lunch, and if you do email us at josephsmithpolygamy@gmail.com, we'll respond, and we'll try to help with answering the questions. So.
That's fast.
Had Joseph gotten a revelation about eternal marriage, plural, before or after he married Fanny Alger? We didn't have the time to talk about Fanny Alger. She, Joseph's first plural wife was Fanny, and we date that at about 1835. And we believe that Joseph learned that plural marriage could be a correct principle as early as 1831. But he didn't write down the revelation until 1843. People have speculated how much Joseph knew and when, other than knowing that he probably knew it was okay in 31 and he wrote it down in 43. We just don't have any chronological markers for when he learned what about plural marriage.
I want to answer this question. It's, how can polygamy not be my story as a woman if my husband concealed himself to another woman after my death? This is a very good question. It's a big fear of women. As you know, 2 of our current apostles are married to second wives for time and eternity in the temple. One of those apostles has spoken on that topic, and that is Elder Oaks. And he was asked, will there be polygamy in heaven? And he said, I don't know. So though they perform these marriages, we don't know how it's all going to pan out in the shuffling. And I think you just have to go back to nobody's going to be coerced in a relationship that they are not happy with.
Why could so many women marry Joseph Smith after he died? Isn't this a strange practice? And this is a reference, I would say, yeah, it is a strange practice, and it was resolved in 1894. But the early saints wanted to get sealed to somebody who was in the chain, back to Adam. And if they were sealed to their grandparents and great-grandparents who were dead, they weren't sure those great-grandparents in the spirit world would accept the gospel. So the chain could go back and end. So many of them were sealed not just to Joseph Smith, but Brigham Young and others, and with the confidence that their line would actually go back. And so we find during the period up until 1894, a lot of men and women were sealed to church leaders rather than their own progenitors. 1894, Wilford Woodruff received a revelation and taught in General Conference that no, we want to take our own personal genealogies as far as we can, and then we'll trust in the Lord that it'll all be worked out before the resurrection.
Okay, polyandry, females having more than one husband. When the 14 women married Joseph Smith, were they still married, i.e. not divorced to their first husband? Okay, the first thing we're going to do is not use the word marriage for these unions. They were sealed for time and eternity. They used that language, even though there's no indication that there was any marital type relationship between these women and Joseph Smith. And when I say marital type relationship, it would be sharing a household, having conjugal relations. Joseph didn't physically give these people money to live on. It's our understanding that those women who were legally married were to be with their husbands for this life. They were not married to Joseph for this life. Their union would only begin after the death of both of them in the eternities. should polygamy be allowed in the eternities. Now, until Dr. Borrego found his results, we thought that maybe 2 of Joseph Smith's supposed polyandrous wives were time and eternity. We've changed our opinion on that since the DNA evidence, and we do have a video you can watch that explains that more fully. The second case is so poorly documented, we just wish we had more information on it, but it's one comment, and so we just can't comment on it.
And just to sum up, we do not believe that Joseph Smith ever practiced a true situation where he was a second husband to a woman, or we do not believe he would have tolerated that in Nauvoo. That would have been adultery, and the person would have been brought up for church discipline. Did Joseph Smith have children with his wives? If you'll go to josephsmithpolygamy.org, you'll see a new chart. I just made it this week and uploaded it. My old charts said there were probably 2 children, but Ugo has knocked out one of those. And the other one I've got new data on that casts serious doubt on whether that woman had a child with Joseph. So the answer is none. A couple of the plural wives said they knew that Joseph had a child or 2, and there's some evidence, but we do not know who they are, have nothing to identify them with. And Ugo has used DNA testing to eliminate 8 out of the list of 20 that's on the website, but those 8 are the ones that most people were promoting as the most likely children of Joseph, and he has just proven them all.
Would you briefly address the theory that polygamy in Joseph's life is a lie, and that it actually started after Joseph's death, as the RLDS insists? Okay, so just briefly, we have so much testimony, and we have journals, entries, so many witnesses, that we just can't deny that Joseph practiced polygamy.
This will be our last question because I think we're out of time. It's a very good question, a little esoteric, but did Amulek have multiple wives? And there are 2 or 3 verses, maybe 3 or 4 in the Book of Mormon where the modern-day fundamentalist polygamists argue that the Book of Mormon actually did allow for plural wives. And it says that his women were blessed by Alma, who was visiting his family. The problem is that we find later that Amulek's family, with the exception of a few, they all left Amulek. So if Amulek was the holy man practicing plural marriage in the Book of Mormon, and his family, it's funny when Alma, a true prophet, shows up, they all leave. The evidence that this was actually a condoned polygamy situation, I think, is very, very thin. I reject it totally. There just is no polygamy in the Book of Mormon. There's one reference in the Book of Ether to somebody having more than one wife, and it was so novel that Moroni, who was compiling that, wrote that in there. So people who try to use the Book of Mormon to support the practice of polygamy, I think, have a real uphill battle. Thank you so much.